The thermos was still there. That is the first thing I looked for when I got out of the truck that January morning. The gravel glassy under a thin refreeze and Clover already pressing her nose to the passenger window, watching me like she knew where we were. The post stood at the edge of Doris's property the same as it always had, a split cedar rail worn pale at the top, and the thermos sat on it upright and centered, its red cap bright against the grey sky. I had not placed it there. I had last seen it that way in December, in the snow, in the dark, after I had stood at the tree line for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I have worked hospice transport for 11 years. I have driven people home to die. I have learned to be steady around the edges of things that other people look away from, and I do not have a habit of inventing meaning where there is none. I am telling you this because what I am about to describe does not fit inside anything I know how to hold, and I have spent months trying to file it somewhere reasonable, and I cannot. To understand what that thermos meant when I saw it in January, I have to go back to the evening of the drive itself, to the snow, to the 18 miles of county road between the hospice facility and Doris Pell's farmhouse, and to the thing that came out of the tree line before I ever made it back to my vehicle. I need to start earlier than that, though. I need to start with a woman named Margaret. Margaret Kowalski was the patient I drove in October, 2 months before Doris. She was 64 years old, and she had pancreatic cancer that had moved into her liver, and she was in more pain than I knew how to manage with what I had available to me in that van. She had a daughter who met us at the door of the house, and a husband who sat in the back with her and held her hand, and I drove as smoothly as I could for 32 miles over roads that were not smooth, and every bump registered on her face. She was home for 4 days before she died. Her daughter called the agency to say she had gone peacefully, that the final day had been good, and the hospice coordinator relayed the message to me in the way she relayed these things, with professional warmth and a hand briefly on my arm. I nodded and said I was glad, and I went home, and I did not eat dinner that evening because the kitchen felt too large, and Ruth was at her book club, and the house was quiet in the wrong kind of way. What I could not stop turning over was the drive, specifically a stretch of 3 miles through a valley where the county had not bothered to fill the potholes since August, and how Margaret had flinched at each one, and how her husband had looked up at me in the rearview mirror with an expression that was not accusation, but was something close to helplessness, and how I had said, out loud to the windshield, that I was sorry, that I was doing my best to miss them, and he had nodded and looked back down at Margaret's hand. I had been driving hospice transport for 11 years at that point, and I had thought I understood what my job was. Keep the vehicle clean, arrive on time, drive smoothly, know the roads, check the equipment, make sure the patient is warm. I had a checklist I had refined over those years, a physical list I kept on a clipboard in the front seat, and I checked it twice before every drive, because that was how I kept myself useful. But I could not check away those potholes, and I could not check away the look on that man's face, and I had carried both of them into December with a quietness that Ruth noticed but did not press me on, because she knew me well enough to know that pressing would send me further inside rather than out. So by the time December came, I was a man going through the motions of his job correctly, while something underneath had gone tight and stayed that way. The call came on a Wednesday. Doris Pell, 78, terminal lung disease, had been at the facility for 3 weeks and was now stable enough to go home, and she wanted to be in her own bed. Her daughter, a woman named Carol who lived 40 minutes south, would be there to receive her. The weather service was calling for snow starting around 4 in the afternoon, possibly 7 inches by nightfall. My supervisor, a practical woman named Jan, who had been running the transport program for longer than I had been working it, called me herself instead of leaving a message. She said, "Kane, I know it's late notice and I know the weather is coming in, but Doris has asked for you specifically, and Carol needs to leave by 9 tonight to get back before the roads get bad." She paused. "I'm not ordering you." I said I would go. I loaded Clover into my personal truck first, before I even pulled the van around, because Clover was old and did not like being left in an empty house past dark. She was 11 years old herself, a beagle mix with a grey muzzle and one ear that never fully stood up. And she had been riding in my truck cab since she was a puppy, because she was small enough not to be in the way and steady enough not to be a distraction. Ruth and I had got her the winter after my father passed, which made her the dog I had needed at the time I had needed one, and I did not leave her home on long evening runs if I could help it. I parked my truck at the facility, transferred Clover's water bowl to the floorboard, cracked the window 2 inches, and told her I would be back. She put her chin on the door edge and watched me walk toward the van. Doris was in a wheelchair when I came through the intake doors, her small overnight bag across her lap, a quilted coat buttoned to her chin that had probably been her husband's size. She was thin in the way that terminal patients become thin, not frail, but condensed, as though the body had decided what was essential and let the rest go. She had good eyes, though, clear and dark and present, and when I crouched down to verify her name and confirm the address, she looked at me for a moment longer than the question required. She said, "You're the careful one." I said I tried to be. She said, "Jan told me about the roads. I'm not worried." I got her loaded with the help of a nursing aide named Denny, who folded the wheelchair and slid it into the back of the van while I secured Doris in the rear passenger seat, with the transfer belt loose enough to be comfortable and tight enough to hold. I had heated the van for 20 minutes before the drive. I had checked the tire pressure that morning. I had a wool blanket from the supply closet on the seat beside her before she sat down. The snow had started by the time we cleared the facility parking lot. Not heavy yet, just a sifting, the kind that collects on windshield wipers between passes. The county road south ran through a stretch of mixed timber before it opened onto the flatter ground where the older farmsteads sat. And I knew that road well enough to know where it collected ice first and where the shoulder dropped away on the left side near the old creek crossing. I drove it at 40 miles an hour, with my hands at a position I had learned from a defensive driving course the agency had paid for 6 years earlier. Doris did not talk much for the first 10 miles. She watched the snow come down through the window beside her, and once she said, quietly, to herself, more than to me, "Good." I asked if she was comfortable. She said she was warm enough. Yes, thank you. I asked if she needed the seat adjusted. She said no. Around the 12th mile, when the road curved south and the property signs began to get familiar, she spoke again. She said, "There's something I need to ask you to do." I said she could ask. She told me that for as long as she could remember, since at least the year her husband Dale passed, she had left a thermos of coffee on the fence post at the edge of her property whenever she went somewhere overnight. She said Dale had always done it first, had always left something out when he came home late from a drive, as a way of saying he had made it back safe. After he died, she had kept the habit in the other direction. She left the thermos out when she left, so that if something of him was still paying attention, it would know she had gone and would know to watch for her return. She said it mattered to her that the post not be empty when she came home. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said I understood. She had the thermos in the overnight bag. She described it. Red cap, steel body, about 10 inches tall. Dale's initials scratched on the bottom in his own handwriting. She had packed it, because she had not been sure she would make it to the post before she left the facility, and now she was asking if I would stop at the property edge, just before the driveway, and set it out before we pulled in. If you've ever sat in the cab of a van with someone who is going home for the last time, you know that a request like that is not a small thing to carry. I said yes without calculating whether it was within my job description, because some things are not about job descriptions, and I had spent enough of October inside my own failure that when a woman asked me for something plain and small and within my reach, I said yes. I pulled the van over at the entrance to the driveway, the gravel just visible under the first real accumulation of the evening. The fence post was 10 feet from the road edge, a split cedar rail that sat at a slight angle from what I guessed was 30 years of frost heave. Doris passed me the thermos through the gap between the seats. I stepped out, walked through about 3 inches of snow to the post, and set the thermos on the flat top of the rail, upright, cap down, the way she had described it. I looked back at the van. Doris had turned her head to watch through the rear window, and she gave me a single nod. I got back in and drove the driveway to the house. Carol was there, as promised, a solid woman in her early 50s with Doris's same clear eyes and a coat that was built for weather. She had the porch light on and the front door open before I had finished parking. I got Doris's wheelchair from the back, got the bag, and between Carol and me, we had Doris inside and settled in her bedroom chair within 20 minutes. The room was warm. There was a lamp on the bedside table with a low-watt bulb, the kind that does not hurt the eyes. There was a quilt folded at the foot of the bed that looked like it had been on that bed for 40 years. Carol walked me back through the kitchen toward the door. She said quietly, so Doris wouldn't hear, "The night nurse will be here at 10. I'm staying until she arrives." I said that sounded right. Carol looked at me for a moment and said, "She trusts you." I did not know what to do with that, so I just said I was glad she was home. I went out the front door and the cold hit my face in the full way it does when you have been in a warm room for a few minutes, the kind of cold that makes you blink. The snow was coming down harder now. My truck was parked off the side of the driveway, about 40 yards from the house, and the van was ahead of me, and I needed to do a final check of the van before I locked it for the night. The plan was to leave the van at Doris's property overnight since the roads were worsening, and Jan had already authorized that, and I would drive myself home in the truck. I started walking back toward the van first, pulling my coat closed. That was when I noticed Clover. She was pressed to the passenger window of the truck, not in the casual way she sometimes watched the world from the glass, but flat against it, nose to the surface, the way she went when she heard something she could not locate. She was not making a sound. She was completely still. I have had Clover for 11 years, and I know her sounds and postures the way you know the sounds of a house you have lived in for a long time. She barks at the mailman at home and at squirrels and at the occasional car that slows in front of the property. She whines at thunderstorms. She is not a silent dog. Whatever had her attention at that moment had not frightened her into noise. It had done something quieter than that. I stopped walking and stood still for a moment myself. The snowfall was heavy enough now that the tree line at the back of the property, maybe 150 yards from the driveway, was just a dark wall beyond the white. The driveway itself was lit by the porch light behind me and by my truck headlights, which I had left on a low setting to help with the footing. In that mix of light and snow, I could see the driveway surface clearly from where I stood, and what I saw on it stopped me the way a physical obstacle would stop you. There were tracks in the fresh snow alongside the driveway, not deer tracks, which I know well and which are small and double-cloven, and place themselves in a particular rhythm. Not dog tracks, not boot prints. These were large, individual, bipedal impressions set in a line parallel to the gravel edge, coming from the direction of the tree line and running alongside the driveway toward the property entrance. I counted 9 of them from where I stood before the line ended. They ended at the fence post. I want to be precise about this because precision is what I have. It is the only thing I can offer you that is worth anything. The tracks stopped at the fence post. They did not continue past it onto the road. They did not circle back. They came from the tree line, paralleled the driveway for the length that brought them to the property edge, and stopped. I walked over slowly. My boots went through the snow with a soft compression sound that seemed very loud. I crouched down beside the nearest track and put my hand next to it to get a sense of the scale. It was wide at the ball of the foot, wider than my spread hand, and long from heel to toe in a way that did not match any animal I had a name for. The impression was deep and clean-edged, not blurred the way tracks get when the snow has had time to drift into them. These were recent. The snow that had fallen into the bottom of each one was light and undisturbed. I stood up and looked at the fence post. The thermos was still there. I had set it upright when I placed it, with the cap down, because that was how Doris had described it. Cap down, steel body up, so the initials on the bottom faced outward. That was how I had left it. It was not how it was now. The thermos had been repositioned. The cap was on top. The body was vertical, centered on the flat of the post rail, set with a deliberateness that I could see even in the dim light, the way you can see when something has been placed rather than knocked or jostled. It was upright and centered, and there was no wind that evening, just the steady vertical fall of the snow. I am not a person who believes in things I cannot explain. I want to be clear about that, because I do not want you to think I was looking for something strange and found what I wanted to find. I stood at that post for what I think was several minutes, going through the short list of explanations that a man like me reaches for first. I thought about wind and dismissed it because of the straight downward snow. I thought about Carol, but I had just left Carol in the house, and her footprints on the porch were not in this direction. I thought about a shifting of the post, a settling under the weight, but the thermos had not just tipped upright, it had been centered, placed on the middle of the rail, and that is not something gravity accomplishes. I looked toward the tree line. The snow between the fence post and the tree line was undisturbed except for the 9 tracks. Whatever had come from the trees had come only as far as this post, and had not moved further into the property. The driveway ran from where I stood all the way to the house, and the snow on it showed only my boot prints and the van's tire marks, and the narrower marks of Doris's wheelchair, and nothing else. Something had walked up to the edge of Doris's property, in the snow, in the dark, and had set her thermos upright on the post, and had gone back into the trees. I did not call out. I did not move toward the tree line. I stood at the post with my hand resting on the cold steel of the thermos, and the snow came down around me, and the property was so quiet that I could hear Clover's claws on the truck window from 40 yards away. After a while, I took my hand off the thermos and left it where it was. I went back to my truck. Clover shifted immediately when I opened the door, turning in a small circle on the seat and settling against my thigh with her chin on my knee, before I had even started the engine. She was relaxed. That is the thing I kept coming back to in the weeks after. She was not agitated, not trembling, not doing any of the things dogs do after a frightening encounter. She was simply present, settled, warm against my leg. I sat in the truck for a few minutes before I turned the key. The porch light at the house was still on. Carol's car was in the driveway. Doris was inside, in her warm room, with her quilt on the foot of the bed and her lamp at the right level. I drove home 18 miles through the snow with Clover on the seat and the heater running and the radio off. When I got home, Ruth was up, sitting with a book in the kitchen, and she looked at me over the top of it and said, "Bad roads?" I said the roads were all right, just slow. She said, "You look like you're thinking something through." I said I was. She put the book down and waited, the way she has learned to wait over the years, not pressuring the silence, but not filling it either. I said, Doris left her husband's thermos on the fence post. Ruth looked at me, and I could see her trying to find the rest of the sentence. I said, "I'll tell you the whole thing tomorrow." She nodded, and we went to bed, and I lay awake for a long time with Clover at the foot of the mattress and the snow still coming down outside the window, and I thought about Dale, a man I had never met, whose initials were scratched on the bottom of a thermos in his own handwriting, and about whether faithfulness to a person can occupy a place so fully and for so long that it draws something out of the dark toward it. I did not have an answer. I'm still not sure I have one now. The phone rang at 6:15 the next morning. It was Jan. She said Doris had passed quietly in the early hours, around 2 in the morning, in her own bed, with Carol there. She said the night nurse had called it peaceful. I said I was glad. I sat at the kitchen table after I hung up the phone and thought about Margaret, the woman from October, and those 3 miles of bad road in the valley, and the way her husband had looked at me in the rear view. And I thought about the drive last night, the smooth 18 miles through the snow, the blanket on the seat, the van warm before we ever pulled out of the facility lot, Doris at the window saying, in that quiet voice, "Good." She had been comfortable. She had made it home. She had seen her fence post. Whatever came afterward had been her own, in her own bed, in her own room. I could not fix October. I knew that. But I had done this one right, and the knowledge of it sat differently than I expected. Not like pride, more like the sensation of a tightly held thing being gently released. Carol called the agency that afternoon to say thank you, and Jan relayed the message. Carol had said specifically that Doris had mentioned me by name on the drive, had said she felt safe. Jan told me this at the end of a longer call about paperwork and the van pickup, and I almost missed it because I was writing something down, and then the words settled in, and I stopped writing. Safe. Not comfortable, though she had been that. Safe. The word Doris had chosen. I drove out to get the van 2 days later, when the roads had cleared. The property was quiet, Carol's car gone, the house shut up in the way that a house goes shut when the person who warmed it is no longer inside. I walked down the driveway to the van, got it started, let it warm up, and then walked back to the fence post before I pulled out. The thermos was still there, upright, centered exactly as I had last seen it. I stood there for a long time in the December cold, the property silent around me, the tree line a dark line across the back of the snow. I could not see any trace of the tracks from that night. The fresh snow had come down after and covered everything. There was just the white field and the cedar post and the thermos with its red cap, and somewhere beyond the tree line, nothing I could name or point to. I got the van and I drove it back to the facility. I told Jan the property was secure. I filed the transport form, checked the dates and mileage, initialed the bottom, put it in the bin on her desk. Then I went home and told Ruth the whole thing. She listened the way she listens when something matters. Elbows on the table, both hands around her coffee cup. I told her about the tracks, 9 of them bipedal, stopping at the post. I told her about the thermos repositioned. I told her about Clover at the window, pressed flat to the glass, but not afraid. I told her about standing at the fence post with my hand on that cold steel and looking toward the tree line. When I finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you think it was?" I said I did not know. I said I had tried every explanation I had, and none of them worked. She looked at me and said, "Do you think it knew she was going home?" I said I had thought about that. I told her. I could not answer it. I told her what I believed, which was smaller than an answer, that something had come out of the trees, in a snowstorm, to a fence post at the edge of an old woman's property, and had touched her thermos carefully, and set it right, and had gone back into the dark. And that Doris had looked out the van window at that post, and had seen it standing there and had nodded, and that whatever meaning existed in that moment, it was not for me to claim. It had been between Doris and whatever was keeping watch over that property, and I had just been the man driving the van. Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over mine and did not say anything else. I went back in January. I want to be clear about why, because I have asked myself that question more than once. It was not morbid and it was not investigative. It was something simpler. Doris had kept that thermos on that post for years as a way of saying she had been there and would come back. And now she was not coming back, and the post would be empty unless someone carried the habit forward. I did not make a formal decision about this. I woke up on a Saturday morning in January, clear and cold, and I loaded Clover into the truck, and I drove the 18 miles of county road south. And when I got to the property entrance, I parked and got out with the thermos. I had bought a new one similar to Dale's, a steel body with a red cap, because Doris's original was still on the post from December, and I did not want to disturb it. I walked through the snow to the cedar post, and I set my thermos on it beside hers, 2 red caps side by side. I stood there for a while. The property was still and white. Carol had not been out to clear the driveway, and the snow had filled in the tire tracks from the van retrieval, so it was unbroken from the fence line to the house. The tree line sat at the back of the field in the grey morning light. I watched it for a long time, not expecting anything, just watching the way I watch a thing I am trying to understand. Clover sat on the passenger seat behind the closed truck window. I did not feel her pressing against the glass the way she had in December. She was just sitting there, comfortable, patient in the way old dogs are patient. I picked up my thermos eventually and walked back to the truck. I left Doris's in place. I have not told this story to many people. I've told it twice in full. Once to Ruth at the kitchen table. Once here to you, and I am aware of how it sounds, and I am also past caring how it sounds, because there is a point at which the thing you saw becomes more important than the way people receive the telling of it. What I know is what I measured. 9 tracks in fresh snow, each one wider than my open hand, running alongside a driveway in a dead straight line from a tree line to a fence post. A thermos repositioned with care, upright and centered, on a post at the edge of a dying woman's property. A dog pressed to glass, but not afraid. 18 miles of smooth road through 7 inches of snow. A woman who made it home. A lamp at the right level in a warm room. I have been driving hospice transport for 11 years, and I have carried a lot of weight in that van. Not just the weight of sick people, but the weight of what you cannot fix, and cannot smooth out, and cannot check off a clipboard. I had been carrying October for 2 months when December came, and December gave me something I did not expect and could not have asked for, which was the sense of having been witnessed in the act of doing my job carefully, by something that understood what the job was for. I am not going to tell you that resolved anything permanently. Grief does not resolve. The weight of October is still there and probably always will be. The potholes in the valley and the man's face in the rear view. But it sits differently now. There is something beside it in the room, something that came out of the trees in a snowstorm and set an old woman's thermos upright on a fence post. And that has not gone away either. The thermos is still there. I drove out again in late February, then again when the snow melted in March, just to check. It was still on the post each time, red cap up, standing as though someone had just placed it. I do not know what keeps it upright through the wind and the thaw. I do not know what crosses that field after dark. I have stopped trying to build an explanation that works because everyone I try is smaller than what I saw. I think about Dale sometimes, the man whose initials are scratched on the bottom of that thermos. I think about what Doris told me in the van, that she left it out so that if something of him was still paying attention, it would know to watch for her return. I think she was right about the watching part. I am not certain what was doing it, or what it understood, or whether understanding is even the right word for whatever it had. What I believe, as plainly as I can say it, is this: something old lives at the edge of that tree line, and it has been keeping an eye on that property for a long time. And it recognized a woman who had spent years placing a small act of faithfulness on a post at the edge of her land. And when she came home for the last time, it came out of the dark to answer her. I drive past the property every week or two on other runs on the county road south. I always look. Last week, Clover was in the cab with me, which she usually is on the long evening runs. And when we passed the entrance, she lifted her head from the seat and looked out toward the tree line without any prompt from me. She held that look for a few seconds, then put her chin back down. Her tail moved just once before she settled. The cedar post stands at the edge of the property where it has always stood. The thermos sits on it in the morning light, red cap up, steady and small and upright in the cold. Some things stay in the place they were set.